All right, welcome everyone. We'll give it a minute or so just for people to join. I see people are joining, which is great. And we've got a very high quality list of attendees, as well as obviously a very high quality set of panelists as well. So we'll do proper intros in just a second. We'll just give it another minute to allow people in. Right. Okay. Let's get started, and I'm sure others will join as they grab their lunch and sit down. Thank you very much for dialing in. This is the second webinar from Stuff for Life. We thought we'd better get on with it because one of our mantras is action speaks louder than words. Although this is words, it is action because we're doing a thing. So that's why we're doing it. And the first one was on EPR for textiles, which obviously is very central to us and close to home. This one is on green advertising claims, greenwashing, as you might know it. We'll touch on green hushing as well. And the reason for that, it will become apparent if you're not already aware, but there are some new regulations around this, and it's super, super important. It's one of those things that it's very easy to mess it up, but it's not actually that hard to do it well. So we'll explore the not hard to do it well side of it, as well as a few good examples of messing things up a little bit. This isn't legal advice, first disclaimer. We are not lawyers, thankfully. You're in the right place. We're practitioners and professionals and, live and breathe these issues. So that's what we're aiming to do here today. This isn't a full chapter and verse on law. Talk to your law department for that. But it's very much from a practitioner perspective. All right, cool. We've got some good numbers coming in. So without further ado, let's get started. So first of all, introductions to the panels. So I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves roughly in order here. I'll go first. My name's John Twitchen, founder at Stuff for Life, and 30 years roughly as a comms bloke in the environment and sustainability space. Before I decided to get on with the action part rather than the words part, and founded Stuff for Life with Miles. We've got Steve on the call as well. Steve's in the background handling questions, Q&A today. So make sure you get your questions in using the Q&A function. If you accidentally use the chat function, we'll deal with it, don't worry. But if you could use Q&A, that would be great. So Ellen.
Great, thanks, John. Lovely to meet you all. My name is Ellen, and I'm a Sustainability Director at Think Beyond. For those of you that aren't aware of who Think Beyond are, we're a sustainability and social impact consultancy, and we really specialize using the platforms of sport and entertainment to leverage positive change. And we've been going for about 10 years or so. I guess relevant to this webinar, really, our work is kind of twofold. The first being, as John said, action speaks louder than words. Thinking about how we can make credible, authentic and tangible actions to realise change. And that's really to stop companies from greenwashing, which I know different to greenwashing, but that's really about not setting unrealistic goals and thinking about the and then also making sure that organisations have credible communications and helping with sustainability reports for the likes of Liverpool Football Club, Excelia and SailGP as well. So I can come on to any questions around those as well.
Cheers, Ellen. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And we've worked together on a few things in the past, including for British Cycling, and Ruth Miller was on the first webinar we ran a couple of months ago. So thank you, Ellen. So Jim from Arco. Jim.
Thanks, John. Yeah, similarly to you, John, I've spent probably 30 years and developed some grey hairs in the sustainability sector, starting life in the public sector with Leeds Council when we were all worried about the DEFRA Green Claims Code of Conduct and how to make businesses, local businesses, comply with that, almost from a trading standards perspective, really. But it was interesting that you mentioned earlier on that there's quite a long history with green claims that is only really beginning to bite now. So, but my role currently, I'm head of sustainability at Arco, look after product, audit, ethics, marketing, a whole range of things from a bit of a one-man band perspective. Nice to meet you all.
Cheers, Jim. Thanks. And Jim was on the first webinar we ran as well as a sort of resident things expert. There we go. And so was David Hughes from Teesside University. Tell us more, David.
Yeah, my name's David Hughes. I'm a professor of materials at Teesside University. I've been working with Stuff for Life for a number of years now, developing some of their innovative technologies, but I also work across a range of sectors, leading the National Circular Economy and Innovation and Recycling Centre, looking across the built environment, construction, polymers, and a range of different technologies. And I'll speak a little bit of some of the technical and some of the trade levers today.
Great, thanks everyone. So quick housekeeping, there's no fire alarms planned. That is a joke, but obviously a serious issue. Bring your own lunch, you know that by now, hopefully those that have come before. The Q&A function I've mentioned and will be done and dusted by 1:30. So you can either have an actual lunch break or get back to work, depending on what your priorities are this afternoon. And it's nice and sunny here. So hopefully you'll get to, if you're working from home, get to experience that as well. Right, so here we go. So a very, very brief summary. Again, this is becoming sort of a normal thing. We try and summarize an issue in as few words as possible. Why are we talking about greenwashing and green advertising claims? Well, they're more important than ever. They really are a big issue now. It's super important. We're all on the front foot. How are they more important? Well, there's new regs that are now coming into force, have come into force. It's more than just your reputation on the line now. It used to be a mild inconvenience and maybe a bit embarrassing, perhaps very embarrassing, and products being recalled or withdrawn or whatever. But now there are some really big fines as well, and all sorts of other issues that relate to the regulations. So we can maybe dive into that if anyone's got any questions around that, and we can answer them. But as I say, we aren't the lawyers. Then feel free to pop those into the Q&A. And then last but not least, as I've mentioned, they've already come into force. So if you're just coming to this and thinking, oh, it might be quite an important area, or I might need to do something about that, you're probably a little bit behind the curve, and it might be worth accelerating up the to-do list or the to-done list, because the regs came into force a couple of months ago in April. So, and we'll come into that in more detail. As I say, the fines are really significant. So just to touch on that, it's a £300,000 fine or 10% of your turnover, which obviously could be for some quite a large number. And it's really, really important that it's done properly now. So now this isn't the first time this issue's been raised. It's been around for a while. I think, Jim, you mentioned the DEFRA regs, which came from a whole bunch of other stuff being done in the late 2000s. This was published, this Green Expectations report from Consumer Focus was published in 2011. I, along with Phil Downing, was involved in the preparation of this and the consumer insight that was behind it. And just to give you an anecdote, one of the adverts we tested print, online, and video, TV and video, and I think a couple of radio as well. But one of the TV ads we tested was an Npower ad for a green tariff, which is a great thing. It was a real thing, and it was well evidenced. And the issue, though, was that, consumers get it. So someone was literally throwing a tin of green paint onto a radiator, and the main feedback from the consumer insight panels that we ran was, yeah, that's greenwashing, right? And of course, the advert itself was really good with really good content, but the way it manifested itself, the marketeers had gone a bit crazy with their green paint and their radiators, and it was completely missed the point. So that was a while ago. We've had 10, 12, 15 years of grace period. Time's up now, and it's just got serious. So that's where we were. This is where we are. Have a Google, have a click of stuff on our website, and have a read of the regs. But let's take you through some examples now. So top tips, very briefly, we published this on our website. trying to summarize it again in as few words as possible, but clearly you might need to spend a bit more time on this. So top tips are: be accurate and clear, really evidence your claims and ensure data is accessible. So you might say, well, I know everything about this and it's absolutely robust, but where can someone else find that information to demonstrate to themselves or others that it's a good claim and it's all clear? Tell the whole story. Don't just pick on the good stuff, the easy bits, if you like. You know, if you're doing something really good and the rest of it's really hard, make sure you tell both those stories, and how you're going to address the really hard bits. And then don't exaggerate or use false equivalences. So, you know, try and use fair comparisons. So there's a lot wrapped up in there. There's about 6 to 10 aspects there, if you like, that we've tried to wrap up into 3 key elements. But, you know, again, as with most things in life, if your backstop is good manners and common sense, you'll probably be okay. Most law is based on good manners and common sense. So, you know, if it doesn't pass the sort of common sense test, then it probably needs a bit more work. So, and of course, we've already mentioned action speaks louder than words. So let's go to that now, with our panel. And what I'm going to do is just stop sharing the screen, and then we can see the panelists, hopefully. There we go. So, yeah, so to kick things off, Ellen, if you don't mind, I'll come to you first. I think, you know, an example or a top tip, one or the other, or both. I think you had a couple of examples that you were thinking about. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to do both, but just to bring it to life a bit, I guess a big top tip that I've kind of seen through working with clients is the need to really recognise protected terms. So in the UK, we have a number of protected terms, and these are words that legally mean something and cannot be used as like an adjective or a describing word. So an example of that might be using the word organic, for instance, and it's just ensuring that if you are using one of those descriptive words, you understand the connotations with that, if there are legal requirements or if there are certification requirements as well. I guess to bring that to life a bit, an example yesterday is a recent green claims code with Target, so the big multinational retail corporation based in the US. And at the start of last year, so in January 2024, it was brought to life on TikTok, actually. So that shows the rising power of social media and the consumer, really highlighting the fact that Target had a clean range, and they called it their clean and green range for cleaning and household products. And that was things such as soaps and wipes and other basic domestic cleaning. What they'd done is that they claimed a lot of the products themselves were clean and green, and also used the term cruelty-free, which again is one of those protected terms, saying that some of the products, including wipes, hadn't been tested on animals and were cruelty-free. Kind of appealed against this, suggesting that there was no evidence to this case. Some of the products used were suggesting they were clean, but actually had banned substances on a chemical banned list, and that was really brought to light. So in Minnesota in September of last year. And currently, again, John's point at the start of the webinar that we're not lawyers, it is currently being debated whether Target were intentionally misleading consumers through that terminology. And it's currently undergoing review in terms of how much they might potentially be fined and what the litigations are. And really, just to kind of wrap that up, that all stems from the fact that they use the term cruelty-free, clean and green without substantiating that and knowing what that meant. So those words you use, you understand those definitions and how that relates as well. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question, John.
Yeah, partly, yeah. Good one. Good example there. I'll give another one that relates to that. So when we did the work in 2011 for Consumer Focus, I also then did a piece of work for Which, the consumer publication, if you like, and we were looking at green claims. So there was a panel of scientists, and then there was me and a couple of others involved in looking at the claims, both what was behind them, but also how they were presented. And there was a particular range from a very large supermarket chain beginning with T that was called Nature. And the contents of the product was exactly the same as Domestos, one of the leading cleaning products. So there was no difference between the leading product in terms of cleaning and a Nature claimed sort of, you know, product. Again, a similar sort of term. It's sort of meaningless and fluffy, but at the same time, if you're going to use it, you need to be clear on why you're using it. And the product range was withdrawn, which fair enough. The retailer put their hand up and said, "Yeah, fair enough. Actually, let's relook at this again." And I think that was a long time ago now. That was a good 12, 13, 14 years ago. But it's a really important and instructive example, I think, of how we really ought to be on the front foot on this now, and the Target example there's a good one. So yeah, thanks for that, Ellen. That's really good. And so Jim, can we come to you next? Is that all right? Again, a top tip or a good example?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely everywhere, isn't it, John? I've just dropped in the chat actually a paper from the United Nations Environment Programme from the Fashion Playbook on communications. I think something like 60% of all claims made by the major fashion warehouses, and these people responsible for up to 8% of global carbon footprint. 60% of those claims were unsubstantiated. And wherever you go, I think, I was on a Southeast Asian Airlines about 6 months ago, and getting a little plastic cup with the UN Sustainable Development Goals printed on the side, with no explanation as to why that was important. That just the goals and the airline logo. Nothing on the website. Staff knew nothing about it. But I suppose closer to home, I'm more concerned with what's going on in our market, because as a professional supplier of safety equipment and services, we rely on being able to demonstrate that if we say an item is safe, it absolutely is, and that extends to sustainability. And I think the commercial challenge that we have to address through this is being able to counter those products and services in the marketplace for safety, which aren't able to similarly substantiate their claims. And it's really easy. I think I did a little bit of a web search on green high-vis, and it came up with actually green high-vis that were green coloured, which was sort of slightly reassuring. But if you do the same thing for packaging, green packaging, you get all sorts of spurious claims made about the individual elements of the life cycle of the packaging. So I think that bit about green hushing and being able to show that your green claim should relate to the entire life cycle of the product is really important. That's my top tip.
Thanks, Jim. And did you mention, sorry, a bit of background noise here, but did you mention green hushing there as well?
Yeah, just the willingness, the over willingness of companies to keep quiet on aspects of sustainability, which are really important, but aren't mentioned in the marketing information. So green hushing, I think, is that focus on things which really ought to be there but aren't. And again, I see lots of that everywhere at the moment in safety.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's a bit of a theme at the moment. Maybe we'll come back to this in Q&A. I don't know what people on the call on the webinar might think in the audience there about green hushing. I did a TEDx talk recently at University of Hertfordshire, where I was at uni, and kind of touch on that in there. It's on our website. You can find it there. Where I don't know. I kind of feel like, personally, it's not the worst thing in the world. And maybe it's of the moment with some of the, political and other stuff going on in the world at the moment. And particularly, I mean, Ellen, you might have a view on this from North America as well, where, some of the terminology, in particular around EDI at the moment, is challenging in terms of, how loudly organizations might feel able to talk about their commitments and talk about their progress. So I wonder if it's sort of a reaction in terms of the words people are using, but perhaps isn't a reaction in terms of what organizations are doing, because I still pick up the fact that organizations are doing lots of things that are really good. So I don't know if anyone's got a particular view on that on the panel.
Yeah, I guess just for context, we have, I think, beyond a lot of clients in New York, and the I guess general consensus amongst our clients is that they're still continuing to do what they're doing, but they're facing threats from Congress and from local devolved state authorities saying that they'll be under investigation for use of technology. We're seeing it more prevalent from an EDI perspective, so equality, diversity, and inclusion. But lots of our clients based in North America are still developing their climate plans, but they're now focusing climate impacts, whether that's carbon or climate change. So words such as net zero seem to be inflammatory. So some of our clients are just focusing on that near-term targets 2030, and they're really doing a lot of the good stuff, but it's not to be disparaging of the US political departments, but they are well versed in stamping down on terminology, but are not necessarily understanding what comes within that. So they're avoiding certain terms, but still and just repositioning it that from that perspective, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. So yeah, David, coming to you. I don't know if you've got any other views on green hushing, and then maybe a top tip and an example you wanted to talk through.
No, I mean, I think we can pick up green hushing a bit more in the Q&A if people are interested. But you know, the longer you're in this game, the more sort of things you see, don't you? I think one of the ones that always stuck out to me as a really obvious case of greenwashing was I do a lot of work with the Institute of Materials, Minerals and Mining on their packaging training, working with packaging suppliers. And in the Netherlands, shipping internationally, there was a couple of big companies that got heavily fined for basically saying that their packaging was 100% recyclable. And the reality was, and you've all seen this one, this is probably the one I see the most, and I still see it. It drives me around the bend. I'm not, you know, I'm an expert in recycling technology. I'm not saying it's not recyclable, but not in this country, or maybe only if you live in a 30-mile radius around this particular plant or whatever. And not many get called out for it. You know, multi-layer packaging and stuff like that, that still says it's 100% recyclable. Well, maybe somewhere, but unless there's a plan to catch it, then that's not true. And, you know, that's one of the ones that always stands out for me. Again, like everybody said, you know, in terms of claims that can't be substantiated. The other one is obviously I work extensively across the construction sector, and CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is really changing the game there. And it builds on what you were saying, Jim, about really being able to evidence your claims. If you haven't got an EPD that is independently third-part verified to a standard, you have to pay the levy. And if you try and squeeze through and you get caught, then you have to backdate pay the levy. These sort of product passports and things like that, that are additional incentives on top of the reputational risk, all build really on the reliability of that data. And then, as everybody else has said, how well that data is reflected. And I think that the key for me, as someone who does a lot of that testing, is making sure that people aren't self-certifying anymore. That's something else that is really not okay. You need to be able to evidence and provide some third-party accreditation often for what those claims are based on, particularly if they're sort of carbon numbers. And the other thing you'll see is that offsets are not considered within CBAM and things like that. So it has to be product level data. So you need to have independently verified product level data. So that's my top tip really, is, you know, as we've said before, be factual based on independently verified data.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And two things to pick up there, and Jim you might be able to come in on this as well. The first, I think there was a recent decision, I think it was Coca-Cola, wasn't it, around aspects of the packaging that were included or not included in that recycling claim. So that was one that people might want to Google and have a look at. We'll maybe put it in a summary here. And the second is I saw a story only last week, I think it was, where the vast majority of consumers in the UK get their recycling information in the on-pack information. I think it's 2/3, 3/4, that kind of level, 60, 70% kind of level, which isn't a surprise, but it makes that on-pack information and therefore the claims that are inherent in that even more important. Two reasons. One is obviously, you know, we want to make sure things are factually correct and that actually markets are being supported for recycling, and where there's genuinely an issue, we need to be doing some work to make sure that that thing can be recycled or eliminated, even better. And secondly is the quality of material going through those processes and channels. So if you're throwing something in which has got other stuff in it, and you know, we're alive to this with textiles, Jim, aren't we? Particularly with coatings and other, you know, trimmings and other materials that might be attached to that garment. You know, it's really going in terms of clothing, it's about to become very important, but it's super important, you know, from a consumer perspective, that they know what they're doing, but also from a market perspective in terms of what they're expecting and what they're going to be handling. So I think there's two aspects to that, the point that David's raising there as well. So Jim, did you want to come in on that at all?
Yeah, I think there's a broader point here about in order to be credible, in order to ensure that you're compliant with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, in order to demonstrate your compliance with enhanced responsibilities for manufacture. We're talking about numbers and assessment and processes. We're talking about processes which are quite complicated, certainly when you're into the upstream impacts of manufacture and transport. The problem comes when these claims are made, probably mostly with the best of intention by people in marketing. And what doesn't tend to happen at the moment, and this is something that the UN Sustainable Sustainable Fashion Playbook mentions, is there's an absolute need for sustainability professionals and communication specialists to get together and decide what it is, what the story is that they're trying to tell, what the data needs are that underlie that story, so that we're able to be ready for the evidencing requirement for not just the mandatory compliance schemes and reporting, but also increasingly towards customers as well, who are similarly having to translate this very technical information into, is there value in this for my business? Am I buying a more sustainable product? We even avoid the word sustainability pretty much all the time and talk about the more responsible choice, and then allow customers to either investigate the evidence that we provide or use one of a number of emerging sustainability independent certification schemes like GRS for recycled polyester. So I think there's a real need to encourage people to work together, to communicate better, but ultimately feed from the sustainability people in organisations.
Yeah, really good point. We've got some questions coming in. We'll go to those in a minute. Jim, I just wanted to ask you one question, and then Ellen and David can reflect on this. What's the one thing that scares you the most, I suppose, keeps you on your toes when it comes to, green claims in particular, but all of those other aspects we've just been talking about with CBAM and everything else?
Yeah, that's an easy one for me. I think it's the comparative ease with which you can ignore quite big parts of impact when you're talking about your products, and at the same time call it green and use certifications in other areas. A big example of this that I'm familiar with is in rubber production, where there's lots going on in our sector, manufacturing wellies, gloves, lots of products that contain rubber, where there's discussion of offsetting, insetting, all the numbers add up. But almost universally, those schemes ignore things like land use change and soil erosion, some big losses of carbon stores through unsustainable or largely unsustainable agriculture. So I think it's far too easy to be able to do that. And I think the challenge to overcome is to tell what should be in the life cycle to dictate that, so that when people are talking about sustainable rubber or whatever else it is, they can put a response in each of the boxes that refer to each stage of life cycle, and then also to talk about end of life and repairability and durability in the same way. But ultimately, all of those things need to be underpinned by numbers and evidence, don't they?
They do, facts and all that. Ellen, what about you? What scares you the most?
Very similar to Jim in terms of the due diligence, but I won't copy him. So I'll say more from, I guess, like a systems thinking approach. The fact that we need to communicate credibly, openly, and transparently to be able to encourage a wider climate transition. For me, if people are working in communications that aren't well versed in it, it's not giving consumers or end users the full story, and therefore it's not encouraging people to make well-informed decisions. So for me, it's the risk of poor communications, unsubstantiated or impractical actions that aren't well thought through due to the inability to have that information, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And David?
Yeah, so a lot of my work is consulting into other people's businesses or selling products into other people's supply chain. So my cement business, it sells ultra low carbon cement to a range of people, and then they make stuff out of it. So then their products have claims on using our cement as the driver. So for me, it's about making sure that the core claims that are nailed on are translated into businesses where I have no control. And making sure that we put mechanisms in place to be able to trace that, because both of the reputational risk and the legal financial risk.
Yeah, because as I understand it, where a component might be part of another product, it's everyone involved in that would
exactly,
be
yeah. So
the party
exactly.
to a claim, right?
Yeah, so just to dive into that, just to illustrate it. So we make an ultra low carbon cement, 85% less CO2 in our plant in Wrexham. Great. Someone takes that and they make a product out of it. It gets product certified. They now sell a block or one of those blocks you see down the middle of the road or whatever using our ultra low carbon cement, and they make claims about that over egg it, or they don't properly, the other aggregates, all the other things that they're going to put in there, they don't reflect those properly. The EPD they've knocked together themselves. They start selling it as, using our to change the numbers. If they get in trouble, I get in trouble.
Yeah.
So there's supply chain ownership, and that is a significant risk, and it pushes the insurance cost up as well to using new clean green materials. One of the limits, and bad practice costs us all money, just the same as it does in recycling. Bad practice around greenwashing costs us all money because it makes insuring these things more expensive, which makes transition to more sustainable materials more expensive.
Yeah. Yeah, really good points there. Really good points. Okay, thank you, everyone. So we've got a question coming in, a couple of questions coming in on different channels. Thank you those who are direct messaging. So we've got one from Nick who did exactly what we asked. Thank you very much through the Q&A function in the webinar here. Thanks, Nick. So Nick asks, how can small companies or startups build the kind of evidence base that will allow them to make good environmental claims? I think that's a really good question, because obviously we've all been talking here about, some fairly heavy stuff, I guess. And from the perspective perhaps of larger organizations, whether it's a Liverpool or an Arco or one of David's clients or whatever, I guess from our perspective as a startup, actually, that is a really relevant question. And so yeah, any views on that? I guess, you might feel as a startup or a small company that, you haven't got that body of evidence, but I guess if you're operating in this space, you probably exist because you want to function. And therefore it's all about evidence. I don't know if that completely answers the question, but, Jim, what do you think?
I think, Nick, I totally get where the question's coming from. It's expensive to be able to look good, and it's also expensive to be able to look good without anything underlying that. I think that small businesses particularly need to begin to think about how they set out their store, how they build their message through the way that they do business. We participate in a scheme called EcoVadis. It defines a set of principles for sustainable business, the way that we procure, that you can apply to any size or scale of business. I'd check out EcoVadis and just check whether the sorts of ways of buying goods is, if you're doing it against what best practice looks like, certainly in terms of EcoVadis's world. The other thing really I think is the reliance on certifications. You don't need to do all of the detailed assessment yourself. If you're in a market for textiles or concrete or many of the consumer goods, certainly cleaning chemicals, you can begin to look for standards like GRS certified recycled, EU Eco label. Those often come with a lot of data with the product, so you can tell that story onwards in a way which is transparent and won't get you into trouble. So I think it's a bit about the way that you do business and a bit about the way that you select your products and the standards that come along with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so David.
Yeah, no, I was just going to chip in on the same thing, really. I'm involved in a number of small businesses, and sometimes the costs are relatively low. For a simple EPD, it might be 5,000, which isn't nothing, but it's not astronomic, depending on how complex the system is. But then when you look at the standards and whatever else, it can all get a lot more complicated. One of the things that I found across all my businesses that has been really successful is partnering with the larger organizations and getting into supply chains. They often, if they're looking at buying it, have a vested interest and in-house capability to support that process, often fund that process. And you'll also see that the new Innovate UK and UKRI funding mechanisms are challenge-led. So around these whole agendas, actually, there's some new calls that have just come out, and they're not looking for small businesses just to pitch in ideas. They're looking for big businesses, the people you would want to supply to set challenges that you can then come up and meet. And if you work with those buyers and you build those relationships and say, look, I know you're missing this information, so tell them, say, look, the problem is the businesses we want to work with can't supply us with X, Y, and Z. And then the government release pots of funding to enable that to come up. So, engaging the supply chain for me, working across all the small businesses I've been in, has been key to unlocking the resource to keep making those proactive steps that lead to sales, most importantly, as well. Not just ones that look good because I thought it was a nice idea.
Yeah. I mean, it's effectively a cost of business, and if you want to compete in that space, especially where there might be a premium on some of these, more beneficial or better products and services, then it's a cost of sale ultimately. It's a cost of activity. So Ellen, just speaking of which, obviously advice is available. And what would be your reply to that in terms of smaller organizations? You work with a complete range of sizes of organizations. So
I think from my perspective, it's just trying not to do everything all at once. In terms of, I guess, green claims and thinking about environmental sustainability more generally, sometimes there's a need to, focus on waste and then water and air quality and all of these topics. But in terms of both your strategy and communications, conducting a materiality assessment and just really focusing on those priority topics doesn't mean your environmental claims are any less credible, but what it does mean is that you're focusing on those environmental topics that are relevant to your organisation and the most priority, and therefore you're not misleading by focusing on, for instance, air quality if that's not material to your day-to-day operations. So doing less but to a better standard can often help you to substantiate those claims and show that you're intent on doing a good job whilst getting your house in order. So not feeling the need to speak about everything and anything, if that makes sense.
yeah, it does entirely make sense. That's really good point. So I think in terms of, there's another question come in here from Michelle. Thank you, Michelle. As a freelance comms person, is there an organization that could be used as a critical friend on written material, in particular web content and so on? I think that's a really relevant question. One aspect that is still relevant is a checking service that you can use from the ASA. So that might be worth looking at. I know we've certainly put comms and materials through that in the past. And what's also relevant here, just to mention briefly on my part, and others can come in on this question in a second. What's really relevant is that say you're in a situation where you're putting some advertising together for an event that you're running. It might be about a project. It might be about a new energy scheme you're running or something like that, or even a new product or service that you're proposing. If there is say there's an opposition group to that proposed change, whatever it might be, say you're a local authority. Any advertising and marketing that a group puts out for or against some particular proposed thing is also bound by the various codes. So it's certainly worth remembering if you're an opposition group, for example, and I've been on both sides of the fence, I'm sure others have before, that any claims you make need to be substantiated and they need to be reasonable. And that's super important, because the last thing I think anyone wants is letters going the other way about advertising for an event or advertising for an issue that are equally or worse in terms of their misleading nature. It doesn't really sit very well. But again, the good manners and common sense test is one to draw on there. So I don't know if anyone else had any comments or reflections in terms of independent support. Jim, I see you've answered in terms of AI and so on.
That was only half joking, John, actually. I mean, I've tried this, and if you go in on DeepSeek, I guess ChatGPT will work the same way, and you've got something that you want to talk about, and you ask the platform, what are the pitfalls around green claims? It will tell you, and you can go and check those out. But actually, the common sense approach, I think, is the best one. But really, the point I wanted to make was, certainly for textiles and the sector that we're in, this has become an acknowledged challenge. And so the United Nations Environment Programme for Sustainable Fashion have got a playbook, a comms playbook, and it's got some really practical initiatives within that you can apply to your thinking on developing a comms strategy or a report or whatever you bring on social media even. And there's a link in the webinar chat to that I've left right at the start. So please do have a look at that. It's really good.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. And any other, David? Yeah, go on.
All I was going to say is you're far too polite to say, but this has been your specialist area, John, for the last 20+ years, and even I working in large multinational organisations have called John into support from time to time, because there are some times when you want a second opinion And you're right, I probably have chat GPT'd it first and I'm still not sure. And I've got all my EPDs and I'm still not sure. And working out how to do that wording ultimately becomes an environmental comms speciality area. And quite frankly, they are becoming increasingly common, particularly cross-border. And people like John, are a resource that we will need to continue to call on.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm too shy, as everyone knows who knows me knows I'm really shy. But yeah, I think it's good to know as well that humans still trump AI for another week or two at least. Anyway, I use the word trump there loosely. So I think that's a really good point actually, and I think all that most of us, okay, experience is important, but most of the time it is common sense, right? Does it make sense? Where's the evidence? Why are you making that claim? I suppose there's a few, why, how, where, what, who questions to ask in that context as well. Ellen, you were going to come in.
Yeah, I was also going to give you a shout out for the work you did on British cycling. John really helped them with their climate communications and how to substantiate using sustainable aviation fuel and things like that. So that was great. Just in terms of a couple of other freely available resources, the UK government does have a green claims code checklist, which is very easy to understand. It breaks green claims down into 13 checkboxes, which is great to use. And then from a carbon perspective, the Science Based Targets Initiative also has communication templates and guidance, which are great. Another one which I'll often use is the Global Reporting Initiative. They have a foundational framework document called the 101, which kind of gives you guidance on what you can report on, and if you don't have data or information, how you then substantiate that through different ways of communicating that. So they're the big three that I'd say are helpful from a general sustainability communications perspective, and also more specifically on communicating net zero.
Yeah, thank you. No, really good. I see that those two. Yeah, there's a bit of discussion going on there, which is really helpful. Thank you. So I think it would be useful to go to the next question. So yeah, one around referencing and evidencing claims. So I mean, I think since the early mid 2000s, when I was first involved in some of this stuff, certainly in-house in the late 90s as well, actually, the web has certainly built and evolved, and is a really good place to obviously put lots and lots and lots of detail. But what's the best way, in your experience, of referencing and evidencing claims that you might have made or might have seen? So David, can we come to you first? Because obviously, you're more often than not deep diving into the data and presenting it in various ways. So how do you sort of get through that? The concrete one is a good one, good example.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I was going to say, let's take a concrete one. And I'll just focus in on the, sort of environmental data from an EPD point of view. Let's just pick that one document, because that becomes then a sort of a central source of truth. Having an EPD report is really helpful in that it breaks everything down, not just carbon, but the water, the biogenic, if it really is a full and holistic. But really what I like to see is when the data is available online on a platform. So in the construction sector, increasingly the de facto standard is becoming one-click LCA, where you can see the building blocks, and maybe you can't see the nuance of the, the top secret recipe that goes into something, but you can see processing, you can see transportation. So you can see very quickly whether it really is a fully holistic, whether it's been done well, whether the numbers that have been used, and this is something I see a lot when you're looking at bringing technologies in from other nations, the sort of the standard numbers they would use maybe don't map onto the European context as well. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. So the dream for me as someone reviewing, whether I'm reviewing for investors or I'm reviewing an EPD to embed into some of our products or services, is embedded into an online platform where I can see the building blocks in detail and really break it down.
Sorry, I went on mute there. There's someone cutting the grass next door. Thanks for that, neighbour. Nice day. Yeah, no, really good example there, David. Jim.
Yeah, I think it's important when you're looking at trying to tell the story of impacts that you you do a couple of things. Firstly, it's not just about carbon. So David's spoken about EPDs, environmental product declarations, and within an EPD, you get, of course, the breakdown of carbon. You have a boundary within which that's broken down. So it might start at raw material extraction. It might go all the way to end of life and recovery and recycling. It might not. But you need to be able to make sure that you're dealing with other aspects that relate to your product, like biodiversity, like water use, like eutrophication, like the ethical performance of the product and who makes it. That's stuff that Arco, I think, does really well. But I think you need to consider that, and my second point is across the whole life cycle. You need to, again, thinking about the discussion we had earlier in greenwashing, you need to make sure that you've got all aspects of that production process covered, and you're able to say something that's evidence-based, but preferably with numbers that talk about the impacts in each of the important areas. And then I suppose really, there is a shortcut to doing that with certifications and looking out for things like GRS or RCS, which some of that work's already been done for you. But it's really about that ability to show evidence that you're moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yeah, really good stuff. And Ellen.
Yeah, really just to echo, making sure that your information is easily accessible, it isn't hidden anywhere. We kind of use just footnotes in terms of conveying those additional details, or send links to supporting documents where the information is more technical. I guess the other thing to get across is that images and design are also subject to greenwashing scrutiny as well. So just making sure that if you are using imagery on your communications, it's relevant, it's topical, and you're not using like logos that aren't relevant to your information as well. So if you don't have any renewable energy on site, not using a photo of a wind turbine, because that also could be subject to greenwashing. So using images and communications in the right way is a big tip for me.
I would say that's become suddenly more important. The number of AI generated or chat GPT style generated images I've seen recently that are a bit tongue in cheek or they're nice or whatever, but they suddenly incorporate all sorts of stuff on, the t-shirt someone's wearing or the advertising on the side of a truck or something. And chat GPT is going to try and get the message you want across, right? So I would say that be very careful, especially in that imagery context. Images are just as likely to mislead or communicate as the words, and probably more so in some cases. Be very, very careful with auto-generated imagery where ChatGPT is having fun, saving you a lot of time, but might get you into a hell of a lot of trouble by the shortcuts the summarization that it naturally is going to take to solve a problem. So yeah, that one's just come to mind actually. I must have seen 4 or 5 in the last, actually from cycling clubs, and they're quite nice. They all look really remarkably similar actually, given that they're all randomly generated. But yeah, that's probably quite an interesting area. I see a hand's gone up. By all means, drop a comment into the Q&A or into the chat if you'd prefer that one, Phil. Yeah, so thanks for that. I think just briefly on one question, and we've got another one, and there might even be a third coming in from Phil or others now. But yeah, where do you think the weak links are? I think we've sort of touched on this a couple of times. Jim, you've mentioned a couple, and Ellen, you have as well. Is it comms, legal? Is it the product teams or the sales teams? Or is it just a lack of sustainability and relevant expertise? Where do we feel that the real kind of weak points are, that advice to an organization that's looking to tighten things up? So, David, yeah, start with you.
Whenever I go into a business, the one thing I always encourage them to do is have a central data repository for this stuff with one single sheet with a central source of truth in. Because the one thing I often see when I go in is particularly the technical team communicate it in such a technical way that it is then not accessible and then gets watered down to the point which it sometimes isn't true by the sales team or the marketing team or whoever else. And so making sure there is a central drive where that stuff is held, everybody knows where it is. There's a crib sheet that you can play from. Like people have said, there are playbooks you can copy and paste from and contextualize them to yours. And making sure that everybody owns those together and that it's shared ownership, not finger pointing. That's always where I start from. Even just reviewing what is and whether they all own those same claims. So often I go in and they say, well, we don't really mean that, or we didn't really mean that percentage. Don't say it then. Yeah, that's where I always start from.
That's really interesting, because one of the general sort of good practice approaches that we've taken over the years is to have a guardian of like an FAQ, which would be drawing from exactly that sort of source of information. So there is an expert, one of the better words, someone who's in charge at least, or certainly responsible. They might not well be in charge, but responsible, to make sure that information is accurate. And it's not about green claims. It could be about, is it a Monday or a Tuesday, or is it black or white or red or, or purple? But making sure that there's someone who has control ultimately over the quality of information that's being used and how it's being used. And this has become even more important now. So, it's standard in political comms, but it ought to be a standard in terms of environmental claims, I would suggest. So yeah, Ellen or Jim, did you want to come in on that aspect as well, about where the weak links might be?
Yeah, I can mention a practical example from Arco where we've started to use a carbon database with a couple of 100,000 emissions factors in that we can apply to all the products that we buy, and complicated products that are made of separate components like shoes, where there's EVA, rubber, polyester. And we've got all of that at our disposal. The challenge is, and this is to Nick's point and his question earlier on, and this is something that small companies, startups can do right from the word go. Our biggest challenge is getting that data in initially on weights and quantities. How much material are we getting? Where's it from? What certifications are applied to it? And I think if we had more of that data, we'd have a much better chance of telling at least the carbon part of that LCA, and make the claims that result from that. So my advice and the pitfall is watch out and make sure you're getting that data right from the start, which probably is available to you from your producers or manufacturers very easily. Make sure you've got it early on.
Yeah, good shout. Ellen?
Yeah, really, just to reiterate what yourself, Jim, and David have been saying, I really like the idea of an FAQ document. And just to add that, like to your point, John, it's not just about those green sustainability claims, it's also about thinking about your wider claims, whether that's on equality, diversity, inclusion as well. I think combining all the teams together in an end-to-end process so they know what they're saying is great. And just making sure that all employees, as far as possible in the organisation, have a sustainability 101. So they're literate in those key topics. And as part of that, being literate in what you can say and what you can't say for those core headlines as well. But yeah, really just making sure you embed comms into the end part of sustainability training so everybody knows how to communicate that eloquently, if that makes sense.
Yeah, really good shout. Really good shout. Thank you, Ellen. Right, last question then. We've got a few minutes left, not many left now, and we might even have the gift of time at the end, a couple of minutes for people to move on to where they need to be next. But yeah, just thinking about what's on the horizon in terms of claims and issues, I suppose, green claims and issues. We've got BNG, so biodiversity net gain, and a whole bunch of stuff around that, which is interesting. Is it circularity and materials and recycling, if you like, to some extent? Where do we feel, in 1 minute each, where do we feel the focus is going to need to be over the next few years? So Ellen, let's start with you.
Yeah, I guess historically a lot of the green claims have been really around circularity and climate. I think that will continue in the immediacy just because we're well versed in that and they're the current target areas. I do think, particularly in the UK, nature will become increasingly important with biodiversity net gain, as you're saying. But I think increasingly, in particular with future generations, social topics are also becoming increasingly prevalent. So I would see, and I think it's already starting to happen, that there's a lot more scrutiny on claims over inclusion, claims over LGBTQ issues, and claims over diversity more generally. So I wouldn't be surprised if environmental claims remained as dominant, with social issues rising more rapidly as well, particularly in a current, political climate where we've got social conflict and, unfair treatment of workers, etc. So I think that will come to the fore as well.
Great. David? Still on
David
mute.
can't
There we go.
unmute himself,
Hello.
apparently. Yeah, no, I was just thinking, I think for me, it actually really linked to that. I think that what I would call the just transition piece, for the majority of producers, not just in the UK, the largest number of businesses though are small businesses, but particularly internationally, making sure that there is a just transition. As we start to put digital policies in, already those policies cost if developing nations 30% more in compliance costs than they cost us, because we have better infrastructure, digital infrastructure and stuff like that. So as we start to put these mechanisms in place for better traceability and accountability, I think one of the big things we have to ask ourselves is, that's great for us, but what is the knock-on impact for emerging economies, and how do we facilitate that global transition, an equitable transition, and again, not just allow very large suppliers to lead the way and actually just impose greater burdens and costs, as we've already heard, on small SME and micro businesses.
Great. And then last word then, Jim, on this.
Yeah, for me, John, this is all about information, data, the increasing availability of it. I think we've been used to talking scope 1s, 2s and 3s for a long time. How you get people to understand what biodiversity net gain is and what it means, what improvement is a real challenge. I see, and we're experiencing lots of increase in the supply of life cycle assessments, LCAs and EPDs. How people respond to those and use them in procurement is a real challenge. So another one of those challenges looking forward is around how we skill up procurement teams in understanding what good looks like. And then really, we've started to engage with some of our bigger customers now through Carbon Disclosure Platform, CDP, as a supplier. So this is the first time I've seen this at our level. Again, it produces a whole new layer of information on risk, ultimately, on climate-related and environmental risk. How are people going to deal with that? So we've got this whole carbon literacy, sustainability literacy issue to deal with, and make sure that where companies are going to put the effort in, like Arco does, into sustainability, we get the response that we need back in terms of sales, profit.
Thank you. Yeah, really good points there. Yeah, I just agree with all of that, I think, to be honest. Right, so let's go back very briefly, bring this to a close, share that. There we go. So hopefully you can see that. There we go. So yeah, so thanks very much for coming along today. Thanks to our panelists in particular for their insight. This is a really tricky issue. We may well come back to this actually in a 2 or 3 webinars time. We roughly do these quarterly, just so everybody knows. We also have a no spam promise, we won't spam you newsletter. So again, quarterly. We're nice and vague, so the next one will be autumn. I think I've done the summer one. I think I have. Anyway, we'll do the next one in the next couple of months, and you can sign up on our website for that. There's a link there. And the next one that we do of these webinar is likely to be on technology and opportunity. I haven't got a date yet. I've got one in mind, but we try and do them on a Tuesday in the month and a lunchtime. So we'll hopefully stick to that, but likely to be in October. All right, and it might well be a double header with somebody else. That's what I've got in mind at the moment. David, you're probably going to get roped into that one as well. Thank you. So yeah, without any further ado, thank you very much for coming along today, signing up, listening in, asking questions, and of course to our panelists, Ellen, Jim, and David, for their contributions, and Steve behind the scenes, making sure everything works, even when I press the wrong button. So thanks, everybody, and we will see you again soon. Last point is there will be a recording on the website, so you can watch it again to your heart's content. Thanks all, and see you soon.
Thanks, John.
There we go. Bye.